Okay, so here we see a plaster cast illuminated by a single light source. And the light source is coming in at about this angle, just so you can see my stick to tell which direction we're illuminating the form from. And let's go through the different properties of light that we see. Now, on this cast, because it is very flatly painted, so it's a very dull white paint, we're not going to see any bright white highlights. Though there are some moments you can see way up here on the corner of the cast where we get a pretty bright reflection of light. So we could consider that maybe possibly a highlight, and some other places that are really rich in bright value, like over here. If this were a little bit of a glossier surface, we'd see more highlights appearing. But then we look at lights, which are areas that are perpendicular to the light source. So I can even hold up my stick to the light bulb and see which planes are perpendicular to the light source. So these planes here and here, this plane here, really bright, and they are essentially perpendicular so that they are 90 degrees facing to the light source itself. So we can call those light. Then we move into general light, which is about 45 degrees to the light source. So if I look at where the light source is and then assess which planes are about 45 degrees, we start to get into areas like this plane right here. As you can see, it's getting a little bit darker. These planes out here starting to roll away from the light just a little bit. So they're still clearly illuminated, but not terribly bright and not terribly dark. And we call those general light. Then we look at planes that are less than 45 degrees to the light. So let's look at the front of the eyeball here. Let's look at a little bit inside the eye socket here, the top of the cheek and eye socket right here, and the nasolabial furrow right here. These are examples of, not all, but those are all examples, the glabella as well, where the plane is less than 45 degrees to the light, so it's getting dimmer, but it's still illuminated by light, so it still is a light value. It falls into the family of the light source. Now, I do want to point out that dark lights like this, the nasolabial furrow, these are often tricky points for students where they think they're seeing a shadow, when in fact it's just a dimmer value within the light mass. And the last value we talk about in the light mass would be the value of half light. Here's a really great example of a half light right here. You can see what's happening is the light ray is becoming tangent to the form there. So remember, rather than colliding with the form where the light ray comes in at an angle and actually hits the form like that, here it's just kind of like an arrow scathing past the surface of the form. That's literally what's happening. So we have the half light. And really anywhere that you find a terminator, so all of the edge of the shadow coming all the way down here, anywhere that you find a terminator, we should find a little bit of half light right at the edge of it. And in fact, when you look closely, you can see a little bit of a gradient tone there at any form shadow edge. So here's another form shadow. Just outside the terminator, we get a little bit of dark tone. And those would be moments where the light is tangent to the form. Therefore, it is illuminating the form, but in the dimmest possible sense. So we call that the half light. And for us, that's really the magic secret stuff to turn the form, to make the illusion of volume. It happens there in the half light. Okay, so moving outside of the light mass, so we go into the shadow mass. Well, the first thing we talk about is the terminator. So the terminator should be really evident in this cast, which is just the line where the light stops. So I could trace the terminator all the way down the cast. Anywhere there's an edge of a real shadow, I'm mapping it out in the air here with the end of my stick. And that's not the only terminator. Any place there's a shadow shape, like here, whether it's a form shadow or a cast shadow like this, so cast shadow moving into form shadow, any place where the shadow finds an edge, that is a terminator. So you can see, as we look at the terminator, we see different types of behaviors to the terminator. Sometimes it's fuzzy and gradient like that. And then sometimes it's super crisp, like a laser line like that. So why should this be? Well, in that case, what's happening is we're looking at two different types of shadows. We're looking at The first type being a form shadow, and the second type being a cast shadow. So as a general rule is that form shadows, like this one, are soft and gradient at their edges. Cast shadows, like this one, are sharp at their edges. So reviewing, why does a form shadow exist? Why does a cast shadow exist? What causes them to be different? Well, in artists' speak, we would say that a form shadow occurs because the form turns away from the light. Now, obviously, that's not literally turning like the planet rotates or something. It's turning by one plane, changing to another plane, changing to another plane, changing to another plane, and so on. So many planes changing against each other that we get the illusion of roundness. And we call that turning form in artists' speak. So we've got here a shadow, which is the result of turning form. In other words, the planes change to the point where they suddenly fall out of the affect of the light. That's a form shadow. So any shadow resulting from a plane change is a form shadow. So I'm just going to quickly go through and trace all the different types of form shadows for you using the end of my stick. So there's our first form shadow. And actually the edge of the eyelid is a form shadow as well. Starting right here all the way across the brow, the glabella, down the length of the nose, the bulb of the nose, and underneath the septum here, that's all form shadow. Down the edge of the philtrum, that's all form shadow, even though it looks really sharp. Scared me. The tubercle of the lip is a form shadow. And the light crossing around the lower lip is a form shadow. And the plane change at the bottom of the lower lip is a form shadow. Briefly, there's a form shadow right here. This is not form shadow. And then we pick up form shadow again all the way through here. We also see form shadows coming up the edge of the head wrap all the way. Those are all form shadows. Okay, so now let's look at examples of cast shadows. By the way, there are other form shadows out there that you could find, like this one, like that one. I was just giving you the primary examples, but I think we covered most of them. Okay, so looking at cast shadows now, we see cast shadow here along the inside. This edge of the shadow, it's one shadow shape, but it has two edges. It has a cast shadow edge and a form shadow edge. So as we said, form shadow out here, it's cast shadow over here. A little bit of cast shadow here where the septum casts a shadow across the face. Definitely a cast shadow here wrapping around the upper eyelid. Very nice cast shadow there. A little cast shadow where the lower lip casts a shadow at the mentolabial sulcus and then down and off the side of the chin. So those are some nice examples of cast shadows. Other cast shadows we see, that edge right there is a cast shadow. And this edge right here is a cast shadow on the bottom of that shadow shape. So those are our different types of shadow mass. We either have form shadows or cast shadows, and sometimes even within one shadow shape, we can have one side of it being a form shadow and the other side being a cast shadow, as in this shadow shape here. Now, let's look at the two important principles that take place in the shadow mass, and these are reflected light and core shadows. So I've got a piece of white paper here I've strategically put in place to amplify the amount of reflected light bouncing onto the shadow side of the cast. So it comes down and bounces back to the shadow side. So even though we see a dull illumination here, I want you to realize that that is not real light. None of this here on the nose, on the side of the nose, on the outer edge of the eyelid, on the outer side of the cast, none of those things are real lights. Those are all reflected light from the primary light source going past the cast, hitting this piece of paper, and then bouncing back in. So take a look what happens when I remove this piece of paper. So without reflected light, in fact, there is still reflected light. It's very dim. It's from the table here. But you can see places like this, the underside of the lip, receiving a little bit of reflected light from the table. And also just from the cast itself can bounce reflected light into itself, such as inside this eye socket here. But let's put the reflected light source back so that we can amplify the reflected light. So those are reflected lights. Remember, those are actually in the shadow. This would be analogous to moonlight. So the light of the sun bouncing off the moon and returning into the shadow side of the earth It does provide a little bit of very dim light, but it's moonlight. It's not very bright. But what the reflected light does is that it creates by default the core shadow. Now you can see this dark stripe-like effect to the form moving down the form. That's a classic example of a core shadow. Now a core shadow only occurs inside of a form shadow. It occurs at the edge of a form shadow. So here's another example of a core shadow right there. We even see a little bit of core shadow here, core shadow along the tubercle of the lip and down the lower lip. Really clear examples of core shadow. Realize that when I take the reflected light source away, those core shadows are still there. They're just much weaker and harder to see. So why does the core shadow exist? Well, the core shadow exists by default. The core shadow happens to be a plane that receives the least amount of light. So we can see that because it's behind the terminator, it can't receive any of the direct light. So absolutely no direct light is received on the plane of the core shadow. Now the core shadow does actually receive a little bit of this reflected light, but the weakest amount of it. So let's look at the upper lip as a great example. This area where we see a lot of reflected light is facing as a plane more towards the reflected light source. When we get to the core shadow, we find a plane which, while it does receive some reflected light, it receives less than its neighbor. So the same thing here. It does receive some reflected light, but less than its neighbor. Again, it receives some reflected light, but less than its neighbor. So we end up with a dark stripe on the form. Here's a nice subtle one right here. Simply by default, and we call that the core shadow. So again, taking away the reflected light source, and we see a much more dense, dark shadow mass, which is free of reflected light, and the core shadows become less noticeable, but they're still there. Now, one last thing I'd like to share with you here is going back to the light mass. A tricky point for students is learning to be able to tell the difference between a dark light, like that one in the eye socket, or here in the nasolabial furrow, and a real shadow. And so with cast training, with cast drawing training, we have something available to us that we can't really do with a real model. What we can do is take a measuring stick, and we can cast a shadow with the measuring stick across the cast. So by making a cast shadow, we can use this as a tool to decipher whether we're actually looking at a shadow or whether we're looking at a dark light. Now here's the simple test. If I can see the cast shadow of the stick, then I'm looking at an area of light. If I can't see the cast shadow of the stick, like for example, in an obvious place, look what happens to the cast shadow when it hits the nose, the edge of the nose at the terminator, it disappears completely. So when the cast shadow fully disappears, you know that you're looking at a real shadow. So I'll draw your attention to, look inside this area right here, and I'll cast a shadow over that. As you can see, you can't see the cast shadow of the stick at all in that area. That means it's a real shadow. Now, I'll draw your attention to a place like this, or like right there, where we're not sure if it's a shadow, so we apply the test, and lo and behold, we see a clear cast shadow of the stick, and therefore we can determine that this spot and this spot are dark lights. They're not shadows. Now, maybe that's more obvious on those two examples, but let me point out one that often throws students for a loop. It's a plane like this, the nasolabial furrow, or the laugh line. Now, there's a plane that is surrounded by areas of really bright light. This is really bright. This is really bright. It's completely surrounded on all sides by really bright light. So it's isolated. It's all by itself. And so the student is susceptible to looking at that and thinking that is a shadow shape. So we apply the test. We cast a shadow of the stick onto the form, and we can clearly see the cast shadow of the stick. Therefore, we can determine that this is in fact a dark light. So that whole laugh line is a dark light. It's not actually a shadow. I think once you see this test applied once or twice, let's look at the dimple in the lower lip, for example. We might accidentally think that's a shadow. Let's apply the cast shadow of the stick over that area, and we can see, oh, that's not a shadow. But you do see where the shadow actually begins. Let your eye fall on that moment right there, the Terminator crossing the lower lip. We can really see the difference here of the cast shadow falling, there we go, through the dimple of the lower lip, and then finally terminating at the outer edge of the lower lip where the Terminator is. So the cast shadow fully disappears once it hits that Terminator. We don't see it inside here at all. In fact, we don't see it until it appears again on the table. Okay, so I hope this demonstration has been helpful in seeing the principles of light and shadow actually happening on form. And mainly that it helps you to decipher what you're looking at when you're drawing from the model. Thanks a lot.